be with you.
And also with you.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, our Lord.
There was a certain man named Lazarus who was sick. He and his sisters, Mary and Martha, were from the village of Bethany. Mary was the one who had anointed the feet of Jesus with perfume and dried his feet with her hair. And it was her brother Lazarus who was sick. The sisters sent this message to Jesus: "Rabbi, the one you love is sick." When Jesus heard this, he said, "This sickness will not end in death. It is happening for God's glory, so that God's only begotten may be glorified because of it." Jesus loved these three very much. Yet even after hearing that Lazarus was sick, he remained where he was staying for 2 more days. Finally, he said to the disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." They protested, "Rabbi, it was only recently that they tried to stone you, and you want to go back there again?" Jesus replied, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk by day do not stumble, because they see the world bathed in light. Those who go walking by night will stumble because there is no light in them." After Jesus said this, he said to the disciples, "Our beloved Lazarus has fallen asleep. I am going to Judea to wake him." The disciples objected, "But Rabbi, if he is only asleep, he will be fine." Jesus had been speaking about Lazarus' death, but they thought he was talking about actual sleep. So he said very plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sakes, I am glad that I was not there, that you might come to believe. In any event, let us go to him." Then Thomas the twin said to the rest, "Let us go with Jesus so that we can die with him." When Jesus arrived in Bethany, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Since Bethany was only about 2 miles from Jerusalem, many people had come out to console Martha and Mary about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, while Mary stayed at home with the mourners. When she got to Jesus, Martha said, "If you had been there, my brother would never have died. Yet even now, I am sure that God will give you whatever you ask." "Your brother will rise again," Jesus assured her. Martha replied, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus told her, "I am the resurrection, and I am life. Those who believe in me will live, even if they die, and those who are alive and believe in me will never die." "Do you believe this?" "Yes," Martha replied. "I have come to believe that you are the Messiah, God's only begotten, the one who is coming into the world." When she had said this, Martha went back and called her sister Mary. "The teacher is here asking for you," she whispered. As soon as Mary heard this, she got up and went to him. Jesus had not gotten to the village yet. He was at the place where Martha had met him. Those who were there consoling her saw her get up quickly and followed Mary, thinking she was going to the tomb to mourn. When Mary got to Jesus, she fell to his feet and said, "If you had been there, Lazarus never would have died." Jesus saw her weeping, and the other mourners as well. He was troubled in spirit, moved by the deepest emotions. "Where have you laid him?" Jesus asked. "Come and see," they said. And Jesus wept. The people in the crowd began to remark, "See how much he loved him?" Others said, "He made the blind person see. Why could he not have done something to prevent Lazarus' death?" Jesus was again deeply moved. They approached the tomb, which was a cave with a stone in front of it. "Take away the stone," Jesus directed. Martha said, "Rabbi, it has been 4 days now. By this time there will be a stench." Jesus replied, "Did I not assure you that if you believed you would see the glory of God?" So they took the stone away. Jesus raised his eyes to heaven and said, "Abba, thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd, that they might believe that you sent me." Then Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And Lazarus came out of the tomb, still bound hand and foot with linen strips, his face wrapped in cloth. Jesus told the crowd, "Untie him and let him go free." Many of those who had come to console Martha and Mary and saw what Jesus did put their faith in him. The good news of salvation. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but that is not what I will be talking tonight about. Try again in 3 years. Instead, what I would like to share with you about is a saint that I have recently been learning about, and in our tradition of sharing about the saints this Lent, tonight I will talk about Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, who was the only Mohawk Catholic saint, and she was canonized in 2012. Before I start talking about her, I just need to set a little context. So pretend for a moment that you are a Mohawk person living in upstate New York in the 17th century. The English, the Dutch, and the French have all arrived on your land and brought war, disease, goods, and religion. And you and your people are just trying to survive. And you are trying to survive this one of the strategies you have for trying to survive this genocide is by having a high value on procreation in hopes that your people will not disappear from the disease and the war. So this is the context that Saint Kateri Tekakwitha was born in 1656. And she was born to the chief of the Turtle Clan of the Mohawk Nation, and her mother, who was an Algonquin Catholic, and had been captured by the Mohawk and then adopted by them later. But when St. Kateri was 4, her father, mother, and brother all perished from smallpox. Kateri survived, but she was left severely pockmarked on her face and partially blind. When she was 10, her village was burned down, so she had her fair share of childhood trauma. And when she was 14, I forgot to mention, when her parents died, she was adopted by her uncle, who was who became the new chief of the Turtle Clan. So her uncle and her aunt, her adopted parents, took her as a daughter as their own, and she continued to be the daughter of the chief of the Turtle Clan. So then when she was 14, her family was like, "Okay, time for you to get married and start making those babies." And she said, "No, thank you, I do not want to get married." And they were like, "This is a phase, this will pass." But it did not change. She continued to not want to get married, and even as her family continued to try to set her up and arrange a marriage, she refused and tried to sabotage any attempt that they made to set her up with a nice Mohawk boy. Throughout Kateri's childhood and youth, there were different groups of Iroquois Catholics who would come and visit her village, sharing the word of Christ. And it was initially French Jesuits that introduced the gospel message to these Iroquois Catholics, but they quickly adopted it as an extension of their tradition. They didn't see Christianity and Catholicism as something that was like separate from their tradition. They believed that the gospel message was a revelation of their creator about himself. So they very much like merged their culture and Catholicism. And then it was the Iroquois Catholics who continued spreading the message, from indigenous person to indigenous person. So throughout Kateri's young adulthood, she's hearing the message of Christ, and she begins to start praying like the Catholics do, and she starts going to Mass on Sundays as a teenager, and she decides that she's going to observe the Sabbath on Sundays and all holy days. And her family was not thrilled with this. They felt that she was basically rejecting her responsibilities as a Mohawk girl and as the daughter of the chief of the clan, because if it was a Sunday and the weather was nice out, they were going to work in the fields. And she was like, no, I don't work on Sundays. So then her family loved her so much that they tried to use some coercive and harmful tactics to try to persuade her to come back to reject her Catholic values and come back to what they believed was the right path for her. So they did things like they called her names, they humiliated and shamed her, they threw stones at her, but she remained, constant in her faith and continued praying and, practicing the faith she wanted. And then later, when she was about 19, she became baptized and she decided to move. When one of these groups, these Iroquois Catholic groups, was visiting, she decided to move with them to a newer Iroquois Catholic village near Montreal. So she went there. It turned out her sister had gone there a number of years before. So she was still with some family, and things were really great at first. She she was still able to live her identity as a Mohawk person, but while also practicing Catholicism, because everyone honored the Sabbath on Sundays in this community, and they worked the other days of the week, but they also prayed the hours, and it was this kind of nice meshing of her culture and her faith. And then after a couple, she was ultimately only there for 3 years, but after a little while, her sister and another woman who became sort of a third adoptive mother to her were like, hey, do you want to marry a nice Catholic boy? And she was like, no. And she had, by this time, she was very devout, and the other people in the community recognized that, and she had developed a close-knit friendship with a small group of women who followed her around and prayed with her. They were known as Kateri's Band. And she was like, I'll stay here with my lady friends, thank you very much. And she actually considered starting a convent with them. That didn't end up happening, but they talked about starting a convent together. And she said to, the elders in the community that she had married Jesus Christ and she would not be marrying any men. One of the things that was interesting about this community is that they learned from the French Jesuits these penitential practices that the Jesuits had, such as whipping themselves with a flagellum to prevent them, try to prevent themselves from sinning, to help decrease the impulse to sin. And the Iroquois Catholic community took this to a little bit of extreme. Not only did they whip themselves with a flagellum, they would do things like, in the winter, cutting a hole in the ice and going in the frozen water up to their shoulders until they finished praying the rosary, and praying the entire rosary in this frozen water. And then St. Kateri took this to a further extreme, so the extreme of the extreme. And even her band of close friends were like, we can't go with you that far. And she would walk on hot coals, and had burns on her feet from that. And she also laid thorns out on her bed and slept on thorns for 3 nights in a row. And eventually her best friend was like, her best friend told the Jesuits what was going on and what she was doing. And they were like, you can't do this anymore. But it was too late. She had already become very sick from this. And she died shortly after. And she was in the presence of one of the Jesuit priests that she was close with when she died. And shortly before she died, he was like, did you ever sleep with a man? And she was like, definitely not. And he was like, we may have a saint on our hands. And then after she died, 15 minutes after he died, he saw her face bathed in a white light, and all of a sudden, like, all the pockmarks were removed, and her face was beautiful, and the community started praying to her and praying with her objects, and miracles were happening, and eventually she became canonized as a saint. So that's sort of the gist of her life. I highly recommend, if you want to learn more about her, this is an excellent book. It's called A Lily Among Thorns, The Mohawk Repatriation of Kateri Tekakwitha, and it's one of the only biographies of her told from a Mohawk perspective, because pretty much all of the others are told from like the French European perspective of those men who knew her. So I highly recommend that. There are three things that I have been thinking about as I was learning about her story that kind of stood out to me. The first is her experience of having a family who loved her so much that they were willing to use coercive and harmful tactics to try to bring her back to the family's values and to what they saw as the best path for her. And I think that that's something that a lot of queer and trans people can relate to. So I think she is a saint of queer and trans folks in that way, or can be. The second thing that I was thinking about that kind of stood out from her story for me was the way that Kateri and her community merged their Iroquois and Mohawk identities and their faith. For them, they were not a contradiction to one another. They really went hand in hand. And I think that sometimes, for me, living here in New York, it can feel like my Christian faith is a contradiction to my identity as a New Yorker, and certainly to my identity as a queer person. I think, many of us have had experiences of people outside of our, unique little queer Catholic community here, not understanding how our queerness and our Catholicism can fit together. But Kateri and her people give us an interesting example of that. And I was thinking about what some of the values of New Yorkers are from my perspective. And I think that New Yorkers value justice. New Yorkers value art. I think New Yorkers also value looking out for one another and caring for one another. And I think New Yorkers have a good value of humor. And I think that all of those things can be an expression of our faith. It doesn't have to be that our faith and our queerness or our identity as New Yorkers are contradicting each other. I think that they can work together and be an expression of one another. And then the third thing that stood out to me in her story was she definitely was not perfect. And I think that her story gives us an opportunity to reflect on the ways that we harm ourselves, and that the times that we think that by berating ourselves, it will help prevent us from sinning or help us, sin less. And I think as we go into the healing service, which we're about to move into after this, I encourage you, if you would like, to take a moment to pray for healing from self-harm and the ways that we hurt ourselves physically and mentally, and to pray for healing for those who harm themselves, and to have compassion and understanding for those who harm themselves. So we will now move into the healing service.